Okay, this PowerPoint is on natural selection and evolution of populations. This is actually part one, so we are only going to cover part of this PowerPoint. Evolution is actually defined as a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. This is actually what we consider microevolution, kind of with a micro scale, so the genetic scale. We could also say a change in the allele frequencies in a population over time. That means that the population's genetics or genetic makeup or the characteristics of their traits are changing. Things don't look like they used to look like. It can also be defined as descent with modification, meaning species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present-day species. Okay, think about Neanderthals. They are not technically considered humans and the term Homo sapien. However, they are descended. We are descended from a lineage of Neanderthals. This is what we consider macroevolution. This is like large scale. One of the other ways to look at the differences is microevolution is something that we can often see. We see bacteria changing and becoming more resistant to antibiotics. We were able to see a species of peppered moth during the Industrial Revolution. You're going to be given an example of stickleback fish later on. There's lots of things we can usually see genetic composition changes. We can see those over time. Macroevolution is not something that we can really see in our time because it's history. This is something that has to happen over hundreds of thousands of generations, which is not something that we can physically measure in our lifetime. However, we can find fossils that will help us to piece together the history. Evolution can be looked at as a pattern or a process. The pattern of evolutionary change is revealed by data from a range of scientific disciplines. So we're talking from geologists, from archaeologists, all kinds of different areas and fields of biology contribute to this idea. The data are the facts about the natural world which lead to inferences. Okay, remember, inferences, if you remember this back from Bio 1, are assumptions we make based on the things that we observe. So we have our facts, and then we can make assumptions based on those facts. The process of evolution consists of the mechanisms that produce the observed pattern of change. Okay, so this is what's causing it. Okay, the pattern is what we observe. The process is what is causing that to happen. Fossils are probably one of the biggest pieces of evidence for evolution because they are physical remains of what used to be. Ideas about change over time have come from fossils. Observations reveal that the older the rock layer, the more dissimilar its fossils were to the current life forms, and from one layer to the next, some species disappeared while others appeared. We're going to discuss fossil evidence a little bit more later, but what they're saying here is that here's your rock layer. Say this is where you are. You're walking up here. Whoop. Come on, pen work. These rock layers are going to be newest. These are going to be oldest. The fossils in this layer are going to look further or look most dissimilar, less like the things that currently exist than the ones here. They're going to be a little bit more similar to what it currently exists. So here's an example again of rock layers. If this is the ocean, you're looking at the layers of rock under the ocean. This would be younger layers, so more recent in history. These would be older layers, more ancestral. If you read chapters 22.2, it reads like a story, and you'll understand how Darwin came about his explorations. I don't really know, honestly, how much on the AP exam is there going to be about Darwin's history, but instead of having you read this, I actually took that off of your list of things to do, you are going to be, it's an option to watch the movie what Darwin never knew. And I think it does talk a little bit about his history in there. But on short, Darwin was really interested in the natural world. So he actually took a trip on the HHSM or whatever they call it for ship, Beagle. Very expensive. He took this really long trip. He looked a lot of islands along the coast of South America, and he picked up fossil evidence as he went, current life forms, old life forms, fossils, anything he could find. And then he kind of pieced together the idea of natural selection. He didn't really say absolutely, but he got this idea that natural selection could be something that's happening. And he noted that all the life forms are a little different. He actually wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. It's really big. Ask Miss Darnell to see it sometime. She actually has it. It's really, really large. It's very boring. And he just documented all the things he observed, and he had the idea that really one organism here changed a little in one direction, and so a new organism was formed. And then that organism also was isolated from this other population, and it changed a little. And you actually get the tree of life. You get phylogenetic trees, or cladograms, we currently call them, showing that species have changed over time and changed enough that they can no longer breed together. That's how we have so many different types of finches, for example. Finches are actually one of the famous things that he looked at in his studies. If you're really interested in evolutionary time, Beak of the Finch is a really good book, and it actually takes some current researchers and goes through some of their explorations. You'll be introduced to it here in a while, kind of building off of what he learned about back when he was observing these finches. Darwin was just interested in nature. He came to conclusions through the observations while on his voyage. The physical evidence Darwin collected did not support the traditional view that Earth was only a few thousand years old. So he was actually very controversial. People did not necessarily like him because he was saying that what we currently thought was wrong. This just kind of gives a timeline of kind of things happening. You might hear the term Lamarckian ideas. Lamarck's ideas about evolution are that for example, if a crab uses its claw a lot, it will grow bigger because it's using it. His ideas were really not very good, but that was a theory at the time. It just didn't hold true. So this is about when he traveled on the Beagle, 1831 to 36. He writes some essays, and then he publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859. So this is long, long ago. It's actually really quite amazing when you think about what he thought then that we know to be true now, and the fact that he knew nothing about DNA or genetics really at all. Remember, DNA wasn't really, the structure of DNA wasn't discovered till like the 1950s. Here's that nice diagram of where he went, where his voyage was. Darwin collected specimens from the Galapagos Islands. Animals on the Galapagos were unique in the area but resembled species on the South American mainland. Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos had been colonized by organisms that had strayed from South America and then diversified, giving rise to new species on the various islands. This is really, really important in understanding how natural selection, which we'll talk about, leads to speciation, forming a whole new species. Let me go back to this map a minute. So here's South America. Here's the Galapagos Islands. And so the finches and the things he found on the island, either a little bit from that border, they were similar to things found here in South America, but not identical. So what are adaptations exactly? Adaptations are traits, right? Inherited characteristics that enhance the survival and reproduction of organisms in a specific environment. So two important things here. One is that it's inheritable. Okay, sorry, it's inherited or heritable. Okay, that's really important. If the trait can't be passed on to the offspring, it's not an adaptation. The other thing is, in order for it to be considered an adaptation, it has to be critical to the survival of the species or the survival of the organism and its ability to reproduce. Because again, if it can't reproduce and pass that trait on, it's not an adaptation. It can't be passed on into the population. Scientists have concluded what Darwin thought. New species arrive from an ancestral form by the gradual accumulation of adaptations to a different environment. This is the key word here, gradual. Okay, tiny, small changes that you wouldn't even notice build on each other over a period of time. And when we say gradual accumulating, when we're talking time here, we're talking hundreds of thousands to millions of years. An example here are the beaks of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. Those are adapted for a specific food available on their home islands. Now, interestingly, when I say we accumulate these hundreds of thousands of years, that's not always true. Sometimes you can see these change if the environment changes drastically. You can actually see these changes in 50 years-ish or so, even less, if the environment changes drastically. So here are some of the finches he looked at. Notice that they look very similar, but one of the things that's really interesting is that their beaks are all a little bit different. Kind of medium size, very thin and pointy, very thick, hard, shorter. And they all seem to be important with what they had to eat on the island. For example, this one was eating cacti. This one ate only insects. Notice how that beak's going to be better for insects than this beak for insects because you're not going to be able to nab them up very easily. This guy is more of a seed eater. Natural selection is an explanation for how adaptations arise. It's a process in which individuals that have certain inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than those individuals because of their traits. So if you are living on an island with all seeds, if you have a beak like this, how well do you think you're going to survive? That's like picking up seeds, bird seed, with a pair of tweezers. Okay, how successful are you going to be? Probably not very successful. If you don't get enough food to survive, what's going to happen? You are going to die. If you die, are you going to be able to pass on your beak trait to your offspring? No. But if you have a beak like this, you are going to be very successful on a seed island. Now, how do they get those traits to begin with? How do we get a difference like this and this? How do those differences arise? Well, through genetic variation. We're all different, right? Mutations arise in the population, just random mutations. The fact that meiosis produces unique individuals in sexual reproduction, these are all ways that we get variety. It's kind of like if you were living on an island and you had blonde or brown hair and there was some crazy predator that only ate blondes, you were not going to survive and be able to pass on that gene, and eventually the whole island would be populated by brunettes. Kind of an interesting thought, huh? Okay, so a little bit about the origin of species. There's a whole chapter on this later, but the origin of species is based on descent with modification. Darwin attributed the unity of life to the descent of all organisms from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. And the descendants of that ancestral organism lived in created habitats. Over millions of years, they accumulated diverse modifications or adaptations that fit to the specific way of life. How did they accumulate those? Well, some were born with something different, and they succeeded more and passed that trait on to all their offspring. Notice this. Time is of the essence. When we're talking about making new species, we're not talking about a few years. We're talking about hundreds, thousands, millions of years. Over long periods of time, the descent with modification eventually led to the rich diversity of life that we see today. Darwin viewed history of life as a tree with multiple branchings from a common trunk out to the tips of the youngest twigs. represent the diversity of present organisms. Each fork represented the most recent common ancestor of all the lines of evolution that branch from that point. He actually had a really good idea, and this is where we get a lot of our phylogenetic trees and our cladistics now. So he saw it like this: ancestor, species, ancestor, species, ancestor, species, ancestor, species, and then eventually all of these were different species of this common ancestor. Scientists estimate that over 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. This is original drawings or ideas, and you'll notice it looks a lot like when we get to phylogenetic trees. Here's a phylogenetic tree. It looks a lot like this. This would be the common ancestor to all of these. This here would be the common ancestor to these two. Here would be a common ancestor to these two. Okay, and so this here is the most recent common ancestor to these, because this is far past, more recent past. The oldest common ancestor to all of these would go all the way back here to where they all branch together. Artificial selection is actually when humans have modified species over many generations by selecting and breeding individuals that possess desired traits. As a result, many crops and livestock bear little resemblance to their ancestors. So this is the difference in natural selection and artificial selection, is that natural selection is happening by nature doing it, and artificial selection is happening because we purposely modify those organisms. This is how we get things like labradoodles. So these are examples of some crops that we have artificially selected for. Brussels sprouts we have selected for buds on the sides because then you get more. Cabbage we've selected for the tip bud because then you get larger heads of that, and so on and so forth. So we have actually selected for traits that we want because they are beneficial to us. Natural selection does it because it's a benefit for the organism in their particular environment. Darwin made some observations in nature, and from those he made some inferences. Remember, inferences are assumptions based on what he observed. Observation 1. Members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. Fact. He noticed that. It was an observation. Observation 2. All species can produce more offspring than their environment can support. Many fail to survive and reproduce. He observed that. Not everybody's going to survive. Inference 1 he made is that individuals who inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. Well, if they're leaving more offspring, they're passing on their particular traits. Inference 2, this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. Not overnight, not in any one individual, over a period of generations. Lots of variety here. Genetic variation is something that has to exist in order for a population to evolve or change. Darwin reasoned that if artificial selection can bring about dramatic changes in a short amount of time, the natural selection should be able to make substantial changes over hundreds of generations. So maybe not dramatic changes, but substantial over a longer period of time. Even when the advantage is slight, these changes will accumulate over time, and the frequency of individuals with favorable adaptations will increase and refine the match between organisms and the environment. Natural selection is a process in which individuals that have certain inheritable characteristics, that's important, that if they're inherited, survive, or that's important, and reproduce, or that's important, at a higher rate than others. Over time, natural selection can increase the match between organism and their environment. If an environment changes, or an individual's move to a new environment, Natural selection may result in an adaptation to the new conditions, sometimes giving rise to new species. Notice this. Did you notice the guy in there? It's harder to notice because over time, the match between this characteristic and the environment has been perfected. This, do you notice this one? Ah, he's right in there, right? So he matches well with the flowers. Remember, individuals do not evolve. If you get anything from my class, please note no individual can evolve. Only populations, or we sometimes say species, evolve over time. If individuals are identical for a trait, evolution by natural selection cannot occur. You have to have genetic variation. Even bacteria, which supposedly are identical to their parents, the offspring are identical to the parent bacteria because they asexually reproduce, they still have changes because of mutations. Okay? Mutations are a huge factor in genetic variation. Natural selection is always operating, but which traits are favored depends on the environment the species lives in and mates. If all of a sudden this species here was moved to grass, you can bet that over generations, that brown color is no longer going to be the dominant color in the population.
Okay, just a couple of announcements. I heard that white.
Okay. Evolution of population. Medium ground finch of the Galapagos, long periods of drought. During the drought, small soft seeds were in short supply and large hard seeds were more plentiful. Which type of beak is better in this environment? Which type of finches will survive and reproduce most successfully? How do you predict the population will evolve? Did any individual finch evolve? Better says no here. The average beak depth, 1976, after the drought. Notice that the beak depth became much greater. Well, during the drought, what did they say? During the drought, small soft seeds were in short supply, large hard seeds. So remember, large hard seeds, you're going to need a harder beak or a bigger beak or a thicker beak to crack those nuts. Microevolution, remember, is a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. The three main causes of microevolution are natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. We're going to talk about these later. Only natural selection consistently improves the match between the organism and their environment. Differences among individuals in the composition of their genes or other DNA segments is considered genetic variation. The phenotype is a product of an inherited genotype that many environmental influences and many Only the genetically determined part of the phenotypic variation can have evolutionary consequences. Okay, apparently somebody popped a balloon out in the hallway and nobody in this hallway's ever seen a balloon pop. Only the genetically determined part of the phenotypic variation can have evolutionary consequences. Remember, it has to be something that you can pass on to your offspring. Without genetic variation, evolution cannot occur. That is key. Scientists often want to quantify how much genetic variation there is in a particular population. In a population, we can measure genetic variation at the whole gene level and at the molecular level, and gene variability can be quantified as the average heterozygosity, the average percent of loci that are heterozygous. Geographical variation is the differences in the genetic composition of separate populations. So these two populations are separated from each other, probably by a mountain or a valley or something. And we can look at the genetic differences between those populations. Remember that genetic variation comes from mutations, gene duplication, and sexual reproduction. Meiosis. Mutations are a change in the nucleotide sequence of an organism's DNA. Only mutations in gametes can be passed to offspring. Most mutations occur in somatic cells and are thus not passed on to offspring. So think about the DNA changes or mutations that occur because of the sun's radiation on your skin cells. Those are not going to happen to your egg or sperm cells, so they are not going to be part of evolution because they aren't passed on. Many mutations are harmful or neutral. If the mutation has no effect on the protein's function, it will not have an effect on the individual and then therefore will not drive evolution. On rare occasions, the mutation may actually enhance the survival or reproductive success. This is what we're talking about when we talk about natural selection. Chromosomal changes, deletions, duplications, are usually harmful. In rare cases, they may be beneficial. Example, a translocation of one part of a chromosome to a different chromosome could link DNA in a new way that results in a positive effect. Again, rare. Genes can be duplicated due to errors in meiosis, and some are very small and not harmful, so they can persist through generations. If this happens, an accumulation of mutations may result in a new function over time. The remote ancestors of mammals had a single gene for detecting odors that has since been duplicated many times. As a result, humans today have about 1,000 olfactory receptor genes, and mice have 1,300. This dramatic proliferation of olfactory genes probably helped early mammals, enabling them to detect faint odors and to distinguish among many different smells. More recently, about 60% of human olfactory receptors genes have been inactivated by mutations, whereas mice have lost only 20% of theirs. Since mutation rates in humans and mice are similar, this difference is likely due to strong selection against mice with mutations that inactivate their olfactory genes. A versatile sense of smell appears to be more important to mice than humans, because it's not very important for our survival. Now, interestingly, blue eyes has been linked to a mutation that occurred many, many years ago. It still exists in the population. Are we all blue-eyed? No. But does blue eyes provide an advantage to survival? Well, no. There's nothing providing you an advantage of survival if you have blue eyes. Now, when we look at sickle cell anemia, there is an advantage for survival, because if you have that one sickle cell allele, not both, but one, you have a resistance to malaria. So sometimes it does matter and sometimes it doesn't. Depends on the environment. Mutation rates tend to be low in plants and animals, but are even lower in prokaryotes. Prokaryotes have short generation spans, so mutations can quickly generate variation in populations of these organisms. That's why you see we can see bacterial resistance in our lifetime, because it takes about 30 minutes for bacteria to reproduce and make a new population. So you can get multiple generations in a day. So you can't get that with humans, so you're not going to see in animals or plants that kind of rate of evolution. Same for viruses, but technically they're not living, but they can actually evolve. Sexual reproduction shuffles existing alleles and deals them at random to produce new genotypes. Remember, crossing over and independent assortment during meiosis and fertilization is also random. Every egg and every sperm that comes together are unique. The combined effects of these mechanisms ensure that sexual reproduction rearranges existing alleles into fresh combinations each generation, providing much of the genetic variation that makes evolution possible. Okay, we're going to stop here. We'll get to Hardy-Weinberg later. Actually, just to kind of give you a heads up, we're doing Hardy-Weinberg in class. We're going to do those notes in class. So bring the PowerPoint slides with you to class to cover those in class. And then the last set of notes on here, the last slide, I will cover again in another video like this. Have a good day.